She sat in seat 9A, loose black hair wrinkled hoodie, clutching a small fabric bag like any ordinary passenger. As the plane shook violently in a pocket of turbulence, Rachel quietly asked the flight attendant, "Is the pressure dropping?" The attendant forced a smile. "Ma'am, please stay seated. Let the professionals handle it." A nearby passenger scoffed. She probably thinks she's a secret pilot or something. But then, through a haze of static, the captain's voice suddenly broke over the intercom. "Night Viper. 9. If you can still hear us, the cockpit is waiting." The plane lurched again, a deep groan rumbling through the cabin, like the whole thing might split apart. People gasped, gripping armrests, their eyes darting to the windows where clouds churned like a storm about to swallow them whole. Rachel didn't flinch. She just sat there, her thin-rimmed glasses catching the dim cabin light, her hands steady on that worn-out bag. The guy next to her, a young dude in a flashy tracksuit, leaned over with a smirk. "Yo, you really think you know what's going on? Sit down, lady. This ain't a movie." His buddy across the aisle, all gelled hair and gold chain, laughed loud enough for half the plane to hear. "Yeah, what's she gonna do? Fly us to Narnia?" A woman in a tailored suit, her nails painted a sharp red, leaned forward from a few rows back, her voice slicing through the cabin noise. "Excuse me, miss, but this isn't your moment. Some of us paid for these seats to feel safe, not to watch you play expert." Her words landed like a slap, and a few passengers nodded their faces tight with agreement. Rachel's fingers paused on her bag just for a moment before she adjusted her glasses with a slow, deliberate motion. She didn't respond, didn't even look at the woman. The silence felt heavier than the plane's shaking, like she was holding something back, something bigger than the moment. The flight attendant, a woman with tight blonde curls and a name tag, reading Cindy, hurried past. Her smile gone, now replaced by a pinched look of worry. She stopped at Rachel's row, her voice sharp. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. You're making people nervous with that talk." Rachel looked up, her face blank, but her eyes steady. "I'm not the one shaking the plane," she said, her voice low, like she was stating a fact, not starting a fight. Cindy blinked, caught off guard, then turned away, muttering something about passengers who think they're experts. A middle-aged woman in a bright pink cardigan, sitting across from Rachel, leaned forward, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Honey, you're meddling too much. Just let the crew do their job. Nobody needs a wannabe hero in row 9. Her husband, balding and red-faced, nodded along his eyes, flicking over Rachel's faded jeans and peeling sneakers. "Yeah, no offense, but you don't exactly look like you belong up front." The whole row was staring now, some whispering, others not even hiding their laughter. Rachel didn't answer. She just adjusted her glasses, her fingers slow and deliberate, like she was counting to 10 in her head. The plane shuddered again, harder this time, and a kid a few rows back started crying. The overhead lights flickered, and a low buzz of panic rippled through the cabin. A man in a polo shirt, his face flushed with irritation, stood up and pointed at Rachel. "Hey, you, stop acting like you know something. You're freaking out my kid." His wife tugged at his sleeve, but he shook her off, his voice rising. "I'm not sitting here while some random in a hoodie plays pilot." Rachel's hands tightened on her bag just for a second before she relaxed them again. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a moment, steady and unyielding, before looking back at the window, where the sky was a mess of gray and black. The guy in the tracksuit snorted, leaning closer to Rachel, his voice dripping with mockery. "What, you gonna fix the weather, too? Chill out, hoodie girl." His buddy chimed in louder now. "Bet she's one of those conspiracy nuts. Probably thinks the plane's haunted or some crap." A few passengers laughed, the sound, sharp and mean, cutting through the hum of the engines. Rachel reached into her bag, pulling out a small dog-eared notebook. She flipped it open, her fingers, tracing a page, not reading, just touching like it grounded her. The woman in the pink cardigan caught the movement and rolled her eyes. "Oh, great. She's got a diary. Maybe she's writing her big hero speech. Hey, real quick, before this story goes any further, can you do something for me? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below about what you're feeling right now, and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to keep sharing stories like this. Stories about people who get knocked down but keep standing." All right, let's get back to Rachel. The plane gave another violent shake, and this time the oxygen masks dropped in the back rows. People screamed, some fumbling with the masks, others just staring frozen. A businessman in a crisp white shirt, his tie loosened, stood up, his voice booming. "This is ridiculous. Why is she still sitting there like she's got answers? Get her out of here before she makes things worse. His words sparked murmurs of agreement, and a few passengers turned their heads glaring at Rachel. She didn't move, just sat there, her hands folded over her bag, her face calm, but her jaw tight like she was holding back a storm of her own. Then the cockpit door swung open and the co-pilot stepped out. He was tall, with a buzz cut and a jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He scanned the cabin, his eyes sharp, desperate. "We need someone with navigation training," he said, his voice low but carrying over the noise. "Anyone with military experience, even basic, please identify yourself." The cabin went quiet except for the hum of the engines and the faint sobs from the kid in the back. Cindy hesitated, then pointed at Rachel. She mentioned cabin depressurization earlier. A row 9A. A woman with a sleek bob and diamond earrings leaned out of her seat, her voice sharp and accusing. You're trusting her. She doesn't even look like she can afford this flight." The laughter that followed was colder, more biting, like the cabin had turned into a courtroom. Rachel stood, her bag slung over her shoulder, and started toward the cockpit. The co-pilot nodded at her, but the woman with the earrings wasn't done. "This is a mistake," she hissed loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're putting us all at risk for some nobody." Rachel paused just for a second, her hand on the back of a seat, then kept walking, her steps steady, unshaken. The co-pilot's eyes locked on Rachel, who was still standing, her hands folded over her bag. He walked over, his boots heavy on the carpet. "Ma'am, have you studied aviation before?" Rachel looked up, her gaze steady, almost too calm. "Altimeter's drifting by 4 degrees, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The co-pilot's mouth opened, then closed. He nodded just once, like he didn't know what to make of her. "Come with me," he said, turning toward the cockpit. Rachel started down the aisle, her sneakers silent, her bag bouncing lightly against her hip. That's when the suited executive stood up. He was in his 50s with slicked back hair and a watch that screamed money. "Hold on," he barked, stepping into the aisle, blocking Rachel's path. "You can't let someone like her in there. Look at her. She looks homeless." His voice was loud, drawing every eye in the cabin. The plane shook again, a deep rumble that made the overhead bins rattle. The executive didn't budge. "This is a serious situation. You need a professional, not some nobody in a hoodie." A few passengers nodded, their faces tight with fear and judgment. Cindy stepped forward, her voice firm but shaky. "Sir, she's been cleared. She's assisting with technical support." The executive's face twisted like he'd bitten something sour. Technical support. You're joking." Rachel stopped, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. She looked at him, her eyes steady. Not angry, just present. "You just lost 2 minutes due to prejudice," she said, her voice so calm it sent a chill through the air. "That's long enough to lose a wing." The executive froze, his mouth half open like he'd been slapped. Rachel stepped past him, her bag brushing his arm, and kept walking. A teenage boy, his earbuds dangling, leaned out from his seat, his voice loud and mocking. "Yo, she's gonna crash us. Look at her, she's got no clue." His friend snickered, one of them, filming on his phone. The camera pointed at Rachel's back as she moved toward the cockpit. The boy kept going, his voice rising. "Bet she's never even been on a plane before this one." The laughter spread, a cruel wave that followed Rachel down the aisle. She didn't turn, didn't falter, just kept her pace steady, her hand brushing the edge of a seat as she passed like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. The cockpit door loomed ahead, and as Rachel reached it, the plane lurched again, tilting hard to the left. A few passengers screamed, and the co-pilot grabbed the wall to steady himself. Rachel didn't waver. She stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. Inside, the captain was hunched over the controls, his face slick with sweat. He glanced up as Rachel entered, and she didn't wait for an invitation. "Viper 9 requesting co-navigation clearance," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The captain spun around, his eyes wide like he'd seen a ghost. My God, only one person ever used that code. His hand trembled as he pointed to the co-pilot's seat. "Night Viper 9. We thought you disappeared after the Oregon incident." Rachel didn't answer, just slid into the seat, her movement smooth practiced. "There's no time," she said. "Your pitch control system is feeding false readings." She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the radar screen, and pointed. "Actual altitude warning is 800 feet higher than shown." The captain stared, his mouth working, like he wanted to argue, but couldn't. He nodded, and Rachel's hands moved to the secondary controls, recalibrating with a speed that didn't match her faded jeans or peeling sneakers. A crackle came over the radio. the voice of a backup crew from the airline sharp and authoritative. "No passengers are to handle controls." "That's an order." The captain hesitated, his hand hovering over the mic, but before he could respond, a security officer's voice cut through the cabin speakers, gruff and unyielding. "I don't authorize someone scrubbed from defense systems to touch anything." Rachel paused, her fingers still on the controls, and turned her head slightly, just enough to meet the captain's eyes. "Then start calling rescue," she said, her voice steady to retrieve everyone's bodies. The captain's face paled, but the co-pilot stepped forward, his voice firm. "I'll sign off. Let her take over." Rachel pulled up the co-pilot's seat, slipping on the headset with a practiced ease that made the captain's hands still. She didn't smile, didn't hesitate, just adjusted the controls with a precision that felt almost mechanical. Outside, the storm clouds loomed dark and heavy, but Rachel's focus was on the screens, her hands moving like they'd done this 1,000 times. The captain watched, his breath shallow, and muttered under his breath, "She's handling this like it's a combat zone." Rachel's eyes flicked to him just for a second before returning to the controls, her silence louder than any response. Back in the cabin, the mood was sour. The executive was back in his seat, muttering to the guy next to him, some hedge fund type with a silk tie. "If she messes this up, who's taking the blame?" He snapped loud enough for half the plane to hear. The hedge fund guy nodded, his voice oily. "Exactly. Nobody even knows who she is. What if she's some hacker or something?" A woman in a designer blazer, her hair pulled into a tight bun, chimed in from across the aisle. "I heard she's been scrubbed from defense systems. Probably court-martialed or worse." A young mother clutching her toddler looked toward the cockpit door, her eyes wide with fear, but also something else, as a hope. She whispered to the woman next to her, "What if she's the only one who can save us?" The woman, older with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, shook her head. "Don't be naive. She's just a passenger. Look at her clothes." The mother's face fell, but she kept her eyes on the cockpit door, her arms tightening around her child. The toddler reached out, dropping a toy plane on the floor, and Rachel's bag, still on her seat, caught the mother's eye, a small faded patch with the letters NV stitched into it. Rachel's voice came over the intercom, steady and clear. "This is passenger 9A. Prepare for a controlled descent. Stay seated." The cabin went silent, every head turning toward the speakers. The security officer's jaw tightened, but he sat down. The co-pilot's voice followed, clipped and professional. "I'm signing off on her actions. She's taking over." A murmur rippled through the cabin, some shocked, others angry. The woman in the pink cardigan whispered to her husband, "They're letting her fly the plane." In the cockpit, Rachel's hands were steady on the controls, her eyes flicking between the screens and the window where the Kamchatka Mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and unforgiving. She reached for a switch, her fingers brushing an old Echo Wave terrain navigation system, something most pilots hadn't touched in years. She flipped it on the screen, flickering to life, showing a grainy outline of the terrain below. The captain watched, his hands hovering over his own controls, like he wasn't sure whether to trust her. "You're using Echo Wave?" he asked, his voice tight. Rachel didn't look at him. "It's the only system not lying to us right now," she said. A faint beep sounded from the control panel, and Rachel's eyes narrowed. She leaned closer, her fingers adjusting a dial, her movements so precise they seemed almost choreographed. The captain's hands twitched like he wanted to intervene, but he stayed silent, watching as the altitude numbers stabilized. Outside, the storm clouds parted for a moment, revealing a sliver of clear sky, and Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, like she was seeing something no one else could. The co-pilot leaned forward, his voice low. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Rachel's fingers paused just for a second before she adjusted another control, her silence answering louder than words. The plane dipped, a smooth, deliberate drop, and the shaking stopped. The cabin pressure gauge crept back to normal, the warning lights blinking out one by one. Rachel adjusted the altitude again, threading the plane through a narrow gap in the storm clouds, the mountains slipping by below like dark, silent giants. The co-pilot leaned forward, his eyes wide. "How did you know to do that?" Rachel didn't answer, just kept her hands on the controls, her face unreadable. A faint scar, barely visible, ran along her left wrist, disappearing under her sleeve. A flight attendant, not Cindy, but a younger one with a shaky voice, stepped into the cockpit, her hands clutching a clipboard. "Ma'am, the passengers are asking who you are. They're scared." Rachel didn't look up, her eyes fixed on the controls. "Tell them to buckle up and stay calm," she said, her voice even, like she was ordering coffee. The attendant hesitated, then nodded, backing out. As the door closed, the captain muttered, "She just pulled off a move only taught in war zone training manuals." Rachel's hands didn't falter, but her shoulders tensed just for a moment, like a memory had brushed too close. Back in the cabin, a little girl maybe 6 with pigtails and a stuffed bear tugged at her mom's sleeve. "Is she a superhero?" she asked, her voice small but clear. Her mom, a tired-looking woman in a denim jacket, hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe Sweetie. She's doing something pretty amazing." The guy in the tracksuit overheard and snorted, but it was weaker now, less certain. The executive was quiet, his arms crossed, staring at the floor. The woman in the blazer kept checking her phone like she was waiting for a signal to tell her what to think. An older man, his hands gnarled and his jacket patched at the elbows, stood up slowly, ignoring the glares from the passengers around him. He shuffled toward Rachel's empty seat where her bag still sat and picked up the small notebook she had left behind. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages, then closed it gently like it was something sacred. "This isn't just anyone," he said, his voice rough but clear, holding up the notebook. "These are flight logs, old ones, military." The cabin went quiet, the air heavy, as heads turned to stare at the small worn book in his hands. The plane leveled out, the hum of the engine steady now, almost comforting. Rachel's voice came over the intercom again. "We're stable, preparing for landing in 20 minutes. The cabin erupted in cheers, some clapping, others crying, hugging the people next to them. The captain's voice followed, quieter, almost reverent. "This is your captain. We owe our lives to the passenger in row 9. The little girl with the bear clapped her hands, her face lighting up. The security officer looked away, his jaw tight. The executive didn't move, just stared out the window, his face pale. As the plane descended, a young man in a hoodie, his laptop open, started typing furiously, his eyes wide. He leaned toward the person next to him, a college student with a backpack. "I found something," he whispered, showing his screen. "Night Viper 9. There's a forum post from years ago, some Air Force pilot who saved a mission in Oregon. It's her." The student's eyes widened, and she glanced toward the cockpit door, her voice barely audible. "She's real." The young man nodded, his fingers still flying over the keys, like he was racing to uncover more before the plane touched down. When the plane touched down in Tokyo, the landing was smooth, like the whole thing had been a bad dream. Passengers poured out, some still shaky, others laughing with relief. Rachel was one of the last to leave her bag slung over her shoulder, her sneakers silent on the tarmac. She didn't stop to talk, didn't look for thanks. She just walked toward the terminal, her hair swaying slightly, catching the airport lights. The guy in the tracksuit watched her go, his smirk gone. "Who the hell was that?" he muttered to his buddy, who just shook his head. At the press conference later that day, the airline's spokesperson stood at a podium, cameras flashing. "We're grateful for the safe landing," he said, his tie perfectly knotted. "Our crew handled an unprecedented situation with professionalism." A reporter cut in, her voice sharp. "Passengers say a woman from row 9 saved the plane. Who was she?" The spokesperson hesitated just for a second, then smiled. "Just a lucky passenger who stepped up. We don't have her name." The room buzzed, some nodding, others skeptical. Rachel wasn't there. She was already halfway across the airport, her bag bouncing against her hip. A young woman, maybe a college student, ran after her, her phone still in her hand. "Hey, wait, can you come forward just for a moment? So people can know your face." Rachel stopped her back to the girl for a second, then turned. Her eyes were calm, but there was something in them, something heavy. "They don't need my face," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They're alive. That's enough." She turned and kept walking, disappearing into the crowd. The college student stood there, her phone still raised, like she wasn't sure what she'd just seen. In the airport lounge, a group of passengers from the flight gathered, their voices low but heated. The woman with the diamond earrings was there, her arms crossed, her face tight. "I still don't buy it," she said, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "Anyone could have gotten lucky. She's no hero." The older man with the patched jacket, still holding Rachel's notebook, set it down on the table. "This isn't luck," he said, his voice steady. "These are coordinates, flight paths, handwritten. She's flown through hell before." The group went quiet, the woman's earrings glinting as she looked away, her confidence cracking. A week later, the story had spread. Clips from passengers' phones were all over the internet. Blurry shots of Rachel in the cockpit, her hands on the controls, her face calm as the plane steadied. The comments were a mix of awe and disbelief. "Who is this woman? She's got to be some legend. Why is she hiding?" The airline stayed quiet, sticking to their lucky passenger line. The executive from the flight was caught on camera, dodging questions at his office, his face red. I didn't know he kept saying, like, it explained anything. Then came the medal ceremony. It was a small event meant for civilians who'd done something extraordinary. The U.S. President stepped to the podium, his face serious but warm. "We're here to honor those who act when no one else will," he said. Then he paused, looking straight at the camera. "Night Viper 9, if you're watching, this country still owes you its gratitude." The room went silent, every head turning like they expected her to walk in. She didn't. The news anchors replayed the clip for days, digging into old Air Force records, finding nothing but whispers of a pilot who'd vanished after a classified mission. A passenger from the flight, a quiet man in his 30s who'd barely spoken during the ordeal, posted a video online. It was shaky, filmed from his seat, showing Rachel's silhouette as she walked to the cockpit, her bag slung over her shoulder. "This is her," he narrated, his voice breaking. "She didn't care what we thought. She just saved us." The video went viral, racking up millions of views, the comments filled with people sharing their own stories of being judged, dismissed, overlooked. Rachel's face was never clear, but her presence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Back in Oregon, Rachel was in a small garage, her hands covered in motor oil. A carburetor spread out on the workbench in front of her. The radio was on, tuned to some classic rock station, but it cut to a news break, the president's voice filling the room. She didn't look up, just kept tightening a bolt, her movement steady, precise. On her wrist under a smear of grease was a small tattoo, NV9. It caught the light for a second, then disappeared as she wiped her hands on a rag. The guy who owned the garage, an older man with a gray beard and a limp, poked his head in. "You hear that, Rachel? They're talking about some hero pilot again." She nodded just once, her face unreadable. "Yeah," she said, picking up a wrench. "Sounds like quite a story." He chuckled, shaking his head, and went back to the front. Rachel kept working the radio, humming in the background, the world outside moving on without her. The passengers from that flight never forgot her. The little girl with the bear drew a picture of a woman in a hoodie, flying a plane, her mom framing it in their living room. The executive lost his job a month later, a quiet firing after his comments went viral. The woman in the pink cardigan stopped bragging about her elite status on social media. Her last post got flooded with comments calling her out. The security officer was reassigned to desk duty, his name tied to the incident in a way that stung. None of them knew Rachel's name, but they felt her every time they boarded a plane, every time they looked at the sky. In a small diner near the airport, a week after the flight, the young mother from the plane sat with her toddler, the toy plane still clutched in his tiny hands. She overheard a conversation at the next table, a group of pilots talking about the mystery woman who'd saved Flight 472. "Nobody flies like that without training," one said, his voice low with respect. The mother smiled, her eyes misty, and whispered to her son, "That's her baby. That's the lady who brought us home." The toddler giggled, waving the toy plane, unaware of the weight of the moment. She didn't need their thanks. She didn't need their apologies. Rachel just kept moving, her sneakers quiet on the ground, her bag slung over her shoulder. She'd done what she had to, like she always did. And somewhere in the back of her mind was the sound of a plane engine, steady now, carrying 216 people home. That was enough. It had to be. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.